Hello, everyone. I'm Joanna Quilty, CEO of the New South Wales Council of Social Service. And today I'm joined by Catherine Moore, who is standing as a candidate for the Greens in the upcoming by-election for the seat of Monaro. Welcome to you, Catherine. Thank you so much for making the time available. We have got some questions that we've shared with you that we want to go through. But before we get to that, if you'd like to make some introductory remarks.
Thanks so much, Joanna. And it was very easy for me to spare the time to be with you because this is, of course, a really important area that governments are ignoring. So I'm more than happy to do it. I wanted to first of all acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Yuin country, unceded land, and I will continue as a Green to work for social justice for Indigenous people. Part of working for justice for Indigenous people involves, I believe, a Truth and Justice Commission. And that, I think, is the first step for healing for Indigenous people, as they have said, so that we as colonisers can confront the injustices that are continuing today. So I really want to strongly acknowledge that I am on unceded land and there's a way to go. The next thing I wanted to do was to, of course, say that as Greens, all our policies are based on 4 really important principles, which if only everyone in the world knew about, I think we'd have Greens in government and you probably wouldn't have a job. So, of course, looking after the earth is one. Social and economic justice, they're all equally as important. Grassroots democracy and peace and non-violence, and disarmament used to be part of that in the old days, and for some of us it still is. So all of our policies, as I've said, are based on that, and which is why I think, we're a really strong voice for addressing some of the injustices that keep on occurring. I just want to mention too that back in 1994, I was the inaugural policy coordinator for the Greens and inaugural convener, and I drafted a lot of our first policies, which I did in consultation with people who were experts in their area, which continues today. And of course, for housing, which I drafted, NCOS was one of my first ports of call. So thank you for the work you're doing and continue to do, because it's just so important, and it's tragic that this gap between rich and poor is not narrowing; it's actually widening. So talking about policies, I was going through them again to specifically answer some of your questions today, and I just feel so proud of them because they're so comprehensive. Our New South Wales policies have been developing. I haven't been involved in policy development for a long time, but they've been updated, over time and are just getting stronger and stronger. So I feel really confident that, we've got such a good basis on which to talk about these issues today with actual, not just motherhood statements. Sorry, I'll stop.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you for those introductory comments. And I too should acknowledge that I'm on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And yes, very happy to be done out of a job. That would be fantastic. That was the end result.
And we wouldn't have to stand as Greens either.
Look, one of the issues that we want to discuss with you, and it's the first question, is to do with the rising costs of housing, which is impacting regional communities right across New South Wales, including Monaro. We're seeing housing prices skyrocketing. We know that homelessness is on the rise. Homelessness services just simply can't meet demand, and there's absolutely not enough social housing. So I guess that's the first question. What are your party's plans to address this really dire situation?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say, and it's a bit of a bugbear of mine, that as long as we continue to prioritise housing as an investment option for people, we're going to have this problem, because house prices are going up and up because people want to make a profit. And now they're also moving to the regions to their second or third house, so that they can work away from home because of COVID, etc. And that is one of the reasons that these rental prices are going up so much. There's one example I know of and it's Braidwood as well. We've got a mine near Braidwood, and there's just nothing for rent for people who don't have a big income in Braidwood. It's in several places around the Monaro. One example I heard of recently was for a public school in Monaro couldn't get teachers. They wanted to come, but they couldn't afford to come because they couldn't afford the rent. So it's really terrible. So I'm going to give you some of our policy aims and principles as part of answering these questions, because they are so fantastic and I just want to get them out there a bit. So in the Greens New South Wales housing and homelessness policy, there are more than 50 aims and initiatives, and starting at number 21, I want to start here. The Greens will work towards acquiring additional social housing stock to meet current need and future population growth, and improving the eligibility and allocation processes as stock expands. 22, ensuring additional new housing stock provides a social mix, including transitional housing, and ensures the delivery of open space and recreational, cultural and social amenities that promote healthy lifestyles. 23, requiring ongoing funding for the purchase or construction of further public housing to ensure that the government owns adequate, appropriately designed, constructed and located public housing stock, with a view to minimising Housing New South Wales head lease arrangements in the private rental market. 24, promoting investment in innovative, fast build or prefabricated construction processes to ensure social housing supplies increase rapidly to address the severe shortage of supply. And then on to number 67, support affordable alternatives to private home ownership. 68, assist groups to purchase sites or buildings for low-cost housing via community land trusts. 69, assist groups to structure legal entities such as limited or mixed equity housing cooperatives to provide and manage affordable housing. 70.3, provide adequate and equitable funding by reviewing tax concessions for wealthy households and organisations. So that's for the housing part of it. And if you don't mind, I'll go on to homelessness, which is section B in the policy. The Greens will work towards 41, increasing the provision of early intervention and support services and programs for people at risk of homelessness, and services and programs for people to exit homeless and secure ongoing housing. 42, ensuring restoration of funding for secular women's only services, refuges and shelters that specifically included trans women. 43, addressing the housing affordability pressures that contribute to the risk of homelessness in order to provide structural and lasting solutions to the problem of homelessness. 44, the provision of supported permanent housing for homelessness that focuses on long-term independent housing solutions in preference to temporary and emergency services. Only 3 more to go. 45, increasing the collection of data to inform understanding of homelessness and service needs, such as street counts of rough sleepers. 46, encouraging all councils to develop a homelessness policy and protocol. And 47, supporting community organisations providing services for people who are homeless or who are at risk of homelessness. So that, I think, demonstrates our commitment to addressing this dire problem.
Yeah, look, thank you for that really comprehensive answer. And you've touched on the fact that, as well as having a roof over your head, people who are doing it tough need a whole range of other supports in place to keep them safe and well. And I think during COVID, we've really seen the social services sector step it up to support the most vulnerable in the community and keep them safe. But the sector is really stretched to capacity. It's having trouble recruiting and retaining staff because of poor pay and conditions. So how will you and the Greens champion the work of the sector, including the work of local First Nations organisations, and ensure that the sector gets the resources and the recognition that it needs?
Yeah, thanks for that. And even if I'm not elected, I can say that we have Greens in Parliament already who are mainly in the upper house, but some in the lower house who are working for some of these things. And there's an example further on, which I'll get to, which shows how useful it is to have Greens. I've already mentioned the example of the teachers not being able to afford to get places down in the Monaro. But also, Kate Fairman in the upper house recently launched the Nurse Keeper program in an attempt to stop the loss of nurses and paramedics. And in 2020, the Australian Greens launched our Invest to Recover plan in response to COVID, and it was fantastic. We had a by-election at the time in Eden Monaro, and we just found it so useful. And I know this is federal, but it can leak through, and all spheres of government need to be working together. So I just want to tell you a few things out of it. It proposes a government-backed jobs and income guarantee to help create hundreds of thousands of jobs and ensure everyone has an income they can live on. Massive investment in health, education, manufacturing and renewable infrastructure, the building blocks of a fair, clean economy. It also proposes to support First Nations people by developing a remote development and employment scheme that is place-based and community-driven to achieve long-term employment and development outcomes for First Nations peoples and ensure that First Nations communities that remain locked down have long-term reliable supplies of food, medications, PPE and access to safe housing. And right now we're seeing that this isn't happening because of poor planning. And just something I thought was worth mentioning also from that plan, it states that taxpayers fund the private health insurance rebate to the tune of $7 billion every year. So imagine what we could do if we redirected some of that into public health.
Yeah, no, thank you. It won't come as a surprise to you that women continue to suffer greater impacts from COVID, including those increased caring responsibilities, greater job losses, and of course the impacts of rising domestic violence. So what will you do to advocate for better support for women and children in your electorate and to address those impacts of rising domestic violence?
Well, this time I wanted to talk about the principles that we've laid out at the beginning of the women's policy. Not all of them, but a number of them that relate to this, because you can know then that they lead to the measures that we would, they're the basis for what we do in Parliament. I think it's quite a good thing to hear that. It really covers everything. So the Greens New South Wales assert that all women have a right to 1, respect, safety, opportunity and self-determination in society. 2, opportunities for full participation by all women. 2.1, in all areas of life, government, business, economic, community, social and domestic. 2.2, including First Australians and other women who experience added barriers, such as women with disabilities, trans women and women from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, acknowledging that these women often face intersectional discrimination. 3, equitable participation in all decision-making processes. 4, legislation to reform and remove sources of direct, indirect and systematic discrimination against women. 5, safety, both psychological and physical, for all women at home, in the community and in the workplace. 6, full bodily and reproductive autonomy and to make decisions in all aspects of their lives, including lifestyle, sexual identity, health, education and career choice. 7, recognition of the distinct and different needs and aspirations of all women, including women from diverse backgrounds. 8, equal access to all forms of education, training and work. 9, affirmative action to ensure equality of opportunity in education and in the workplace. And don't get me started on this argument that it's all based on merit, because that's basically saying women don't have the merit and the skills to do it. And I just think we've got to get rid of this idea immediately. We need affirmative action to address the imbalances. 10, ensuring that all Greens policies are developed with consideration of the impacts on women and with input from women. 11, the particular needs and rights of Indigenous women to self-determination and full access to social, economic and health services that ensure their full participation and rightful status in their communities and society. And as I said, the many specific policy measures that you can find following that in the policy all follow from those principles.
Look, thank you. And flowing on from that, there's a surprisingly large proportion of children growing up in poverty in the electorate of Monaro. And we know that this places them at greater risk of abuse, neglect and poor educational outcomes. So what are your policies to support parents and to promote children's wellbeing?
Well, a little bit tied to that, and the second part of your question, which maybe I didn't address it, you might have said it, but what will you advocate for to better support women and children in the electorate and prevent tragic outcomes for women and children escaping domestic violence? Could I talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it all gets to the issue of children's wellbeing. Absolutely.
Yeah. And my answer to that follows on from that.
Yeah.
So first, referring to the housing and homelessness policy, I think I might have said 42, ensuring restoration of funding for secular women's only services, refuges and shelters that specifically included trans women. I said that. But new, increasing crisis and emergency accommodation and support and services to support the vulnerable to avoid exposure to ongoing risks. 31, ensuring the provision of housing services, both crisis and long-term, that specifically support people on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity and intersex status, with a particular focus on rural, regional and remote areas. So that's great for us in Monaro. In addition, from our domestic and family violence and abuse policy, which is a separate policy, That's broken down into the areas of primary prevention, frontline support, safe accommodation, access to justice and trauma recovery. The Greens will work towards 24, the full integration of the Staying Home Leaving Violence program with a safer pathway reforms statewide to ensure that every woman and child who is experiencing domestic and family violence and abuse is given the option and support to stay in their home safely, including support with safety planning, improving home security, help in managing finances, support for children, and help with legal process. 25, ensuring all people experiencing domestic and family violence and abuse can immediately access secure crisis and transitional housing, including accommodation that allows them to remain with and care for their children. And then in the access to justice section, 31, reforming New South Wales criminal law to create an offence of coercive control. Well, I'm sure you're aware that last December that went through Parliament, so that's actually going to happen, and that was largely as a result of having Greens in Parliament. 32, funding for specialist women's legal services and community legal centres around New South Wales to meet the multiple and complex legal needs of women and children experiencing violence, including services targeted specifically towards Aboriginal women, women living in regional, rural and remote areas, and women in prison. 2 more, ensuring that all people who have experienced sexual, domestic and family violence and abuse can access courts safely through the provisions of safe waiting areas and rooms that are accessible for people with disability, separate entry and exit points, quality audio-visual link and interpreting facilities across local children's and family law courts, and 34, provision of financial support for travel, childcare and other costs that create a barrier to attending court. So that was that one. So if you like, I can move straight on to the supporting families question that you asked me.
Yeah, absolutely. And we certainly know that children being exposed to domestic violence is one of the key underlying factors when it comes to abuse and neglect. So obviously these issues are all interrelated. But yeah, if we could quickly touch on how would you support families and parents and promote the wellbeing of children more generally, that would be great.
Okay, great. The first of the 17 actions in the child abuse, neglect and exploitation section of the Children and Young People Policy you can find online are the Greens New South Wales will significantly increase funding to the Department of Family and Community Services so that it can effectively deal with the issue of child abuse, neglect and exploitation. I mean, I could refer you to these. There's 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28 and 29. It's all there.
Yeah, and look, I think we can put the links to these policy documents because they're obviously pretty comprehensive and just have a look at them.
Exactly. Yeah. I just drew them out because they specifically related to those questions. But, there's some great detail which address all the issues that people are facing on a day-to-day basis. So,
yeah, absolutely. Look, we do want to touch on the issue of emergency responses before we finish up, given that we're all living in that environment at the moment. The research tells us that top-down emergency responses can suffer from lack of local knowledge, either too much too soon or too little too late. What do you think are the key issues in developing disaster preparedness and emergency response systems that actually work?
Well, I'm answering this not with any policy points, but with some points that I've noted down from my own experience during Black Summer in particular. It highlighted a number of problems in our emergency response plan, and local knowledge is almost at the top of that list. The so-called hazard reduction burning program started a number of fires which ended up destroying hundreds of thousands of hectares. It's essential that we work with First Nations people to reduce as much as is possible the bushfire hazards. And the way to do that is not to do these knee-jerk burns, but to pay Indigenous people to do cool, gentle burns that we are there for, so that we can learn that won't destroy everything that's left. Communication amongst the peak bodies was poor. Local brigades were not allowed to respond to some incidents which resulted in tragic outcomes just because of the way the legislation is constructed. A poorly funded national parks sector has left national parks workers struggling to do the work that's necessary, and they often end up taking the blame for fires and for feral plant and animal spread, you name it. And there's been a knee-jerk reaction from the state government, which I found really disappointing to Black Summer. It's resulted in the clearing of huge areas of vegetation along roads and properties. And this, in turn, has led to the loss of even more of the biodiversity and the habitat and the remnant vegetation. that was, not burnt, and it will not stop the devastation from further onslaughts. And I think, and science says, that in many cases it will make it worse because areas are more able to dry out as a result of the wind tunnels that have been caused. And how did all this come about? It came about because of ongoing inaction on climate change over decades by successive governments. And we've still got a few minutes to talk about COVID and climate change, I hope.
Well, we do have a final question, which is about the fact that we are seeing more and more disasters as a result of climate change, including, the current pandemic, floods, bushfires and droughts. And all of this is having the greatest impact in rural areas for disadvantaged groups. And I think in particular on our health system, and that's certainly the case as a result of the pandemic. So my question is, what do we need to ensure happens so that our local health systems are robust enough to cope with these occurrences? Obviously, impacts across a whole range of systems, but really interested in what you think needs to happen in relation to the health system.
Okay, and I'm talking about health, but a few other things. And I think I can fit this rant, because it will be a bit of a rant, into 3 minutes that we have left. Okay, so I've put it down here. We need governments to think about long-term solutions for these problems. Until they do it, it will be all about populist Band-Aid solutions, as it has been to date. Health itself in this state and in Australia is Band-Aid. When people don't have enough money for nutritious food, to find adequate safe shelter, get affordable dental care, they smoke a lot because of life stresses, take drugs to feel better, they're setting themselves up for ill health, often no fault of their own. Drug law reform is urgently needed, so addiction is treated as a health and safety issue rather than a law and order one. Governments need to stop taking donations from the hotels industry, which is indirectly causing family breakups and poverty through poker machine and gambling addiction. Similarly, they need to stop receiving money from the fossil fuel industry. Donations are at all-time high. I think it was 2.1 or 2 million announced this week, and that doesn't include the dark money. And that's just from the fossil fuel industry going to government, not from the other industries. And the coal industry is not only unhealthy for its workers, but it causes lung disease in the communities near the coal mines too, not to mention the deaths that are caused by extreme weather events and temperature extremes, which are now recognised as being brought on by climate heating from excess greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. So again, I'd refer you to the Invest to Recover program. Just Google Invest to Recover and you'll find that, which would direct much needed funds into health services. But Greens policies in general are for the long-term preventative solutions. Just finally, job seeker benefits need to properly reflect the increasing cost of living. But better than that, we need a universal basic income introduced as soon as possible. And it's pleasing to see that this is actually starting to be talked about now. Before it was, oh no, that's too socialist, we can't mention that. But, the mainstream is taking it on. So I really hope that, it becomes a thing very soon. Many people would be happy to have a guaranteed income that is enough to live on without them having to find non-existent jobs. Talking of which, let's stop pretending that we have almost record low levels of employment. The federal government is lying to us when it does not acknowledge that the 95.8% of people who have so-called jobs includes all those, and there are many who have an hour's work a week. The foundation, in particular, of the LNP approach is survival of the fittest and the right of the individual. This has led to the gap between rich and poor growing every day, with obscene profits for a very few people at the expense of environmental health and social justice. And it's high time we focused on the greater good. Here endeth my rant.
Thank you very much for that. We've covered a lot of ground and explored a lot of issues and the policy positions that the Greens have out there. We've really appreciated your time today, Catherine, and we wish you all the best in the by-election on the 12th of February for Monaro.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Thank you.
Okay.